Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who 50 Years Ago, the show that looks back to the episode that aired in 1970 and looks at the differences between then and now. This week, The Silurians, episode 3, and I hope you like a cynical view of humanity because you're gonna get it. I'm Ben.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Nick.
And here we are, and here we go into the news from 1970. First, on Thursday the 12th of February, the Israeli Air Force drops napalm and delayed fuse bombs on a scrap metal factory in Egypt. They've missed their military targets and killed 68 civilian workers. Their defense minister disclosed that one of the bombs had a 24-hour delay on it before it was going to blow up and asked the Red Cross to notify the Egyptian government. So whilst civilian casualties are occurring, and continue to occur 50 years later because the question of the Middle East is not going to be answered with peaceful coexistence anytime soon, at least the Israeli Air Force are being sort of decent in notifying their enemies. Whoops, we messed up. Sorry about your factory.
Yeah, I mean, Israel's one of those things, is one of those little, like, political footballs that you can't... There isn't a right answer to it. So one should never really claim to join a side with it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a can of worms that's not worth opening.
Yeah, it's a very tricky scenario in that sector of the world where certain aspects of land are occupied by several different countries.
And what's happened 50 years later is that certain occupying powers are still occupying bits of land that most countries do not recognize as being legally occupied, except for the most powerful country in the world, which now has decided to come down firmly on the side of said illegal occupiers. Yes.
So, yeah, it's a case of a really, really powerful Western, dare we say it, colonial country trying to, draw lines where they really shouldn't be drawn. And where have we seen that before in history? And did that cause a million deaths? It's a tricky tale, and it's not going to be resolved anytime soon. And that is a story both 50 years ago and now. On slightly less darker notes, on Friday the 13th of February, Black Sabbath, the first heavy metal album, went on sale in Britain. Luke, could you kindly tell us about Black Sabbath and how it represents a culture change from the 1960s to the 1970s, if you please?
Well, my credentials for this are going to be the picture that's put on the screen now. And that is technically what I look like. Essentially, the way I categorize Black Sabbath in my head is that the music no longer likes you. When they first made it, the word heavy metal didn't exist. They called it downer rock, right?
Ooh.
Yes. So if you look at the music people most associate with proto-metal, it's stuff like Led Zeppelin's first couple of albums. You've got I Put a Spell on You by Screamin' Jay Hawkins. You've got Jimi Hendrix to an extent and In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. Most of those, to me, they sound like they're doing melodies and hooks in a way which Black Sabbath weren't doing. The music is so much darker and seems so much more angry, whereas the 60s were more about flower power hippie stuff, right? And actually in like 1969 you get a lot heavier kind of stuff. There is a market for this and people flock towards Black Sabbath when it comes out. The critics despise it, but it sells like hot cakes. I wish I had a more metal analogy than that, but that's what you get. Satanically hot cakes, there you go.
Okay, sorry.
So people start flocking towards that and it gets really successful. You get all of metal and history's improved forever. However, also in the 70s, you get a massive, awful, disgustingly bad boom in crummy, easy listening. And it just goes to show that when there's one trend towards one extreme, there's always a trend pushing the other way. And 1974 is considered one of the worst years for pop music ever because it's all easy listening garbage ballads, including one of the best-selling songs of all time called You Light Up My Life, which, you know, whiter than milk.
It is a dichotomy of musical trends, and that necessarily can be translated into a dichotomy of public opinion in the 1970s and of the 1970s. Very fascinating.
Well, and of now, and as much as we also now exist in an age of extremes. You're not just in the middle, you are either for or against certain things, and you're very firmly for or against them, aren't you?
Yes, very, very true of very many subjects. And finally, on Saturday the 14th of February, North Korea released 39 of 46 South Korean passengers that it had held after hijacking a Korean plane. The other 7 were not allowed to leave, and their fate remains unknown. All North Korea and its hatred of the West is a hangover of the Korean War in the early 50s, and beyond that to a hangover of Western influence in Eastern countries, because obviously the Westerners got the Industrial Revolution and colonized and so on. North Korea remains autocratic to this very day, and it's just that America's now having a nice taste of it with a sort of imperial presidency 50 years ago under Nixon and a shambolic presidency elected by an inward-looking America now. Also, we'll bring up a point about North Korea later on in the actual episode.
Well, I mean, this isn't the first time that North Korea kidnaps people, is it?
No, to be honest, it's just their way of doing diplomacy.
Yeah, I seem to remember that at some point they kidnapped either a Japanese or a South Korean director to make films. I think it's like one of the dictators just decided, hey, he wanted movies made, so he kidnapped a director, and that and that was his. That's how he got movies made. He wasn't gonna train a North Korean guy. He was gonna go and get some poor other guy who actually could direct.
Which is a very free market way of doing things for North Korea.
Well, I mean,
go out there and poach.
Yeah, it's funny. They're the classic case of they claim to be communist, but actually they're an absolute monarchy. You always know when a country is not democratic when it puts democratic in its title.
Did the people get a vote on what to call North Korea? You know, the Democratic Republic, or did they say, we are very democratic. We are now the Democratic Republic. There will be no argument.
Well,
and that was the news. And now we shall get into the Silurians, episode 3, aired the 14th of February 1970. Yes, okay, the slow pace is more evident in this episode. There's a long-winded search for the Silurian, which ends in a dead scientist. And selfishness is a key part of this episode, as we shall discover. We talked last episode on how Malcolm Holt characterises his troupe of characters, and it's evident in this episode too, but also about elements of humanity which are interpretable. This episode has depth, if you look for it, and I will be talking about how Quinn establishes himself, how Miss Dawson establishes herself, and how Major Baker establishes himself.
I find this one a very tricky one for the purposes of our podcast, because there's a problem with something that is just really, really good in its own way, that our kind of 50 years ago thing starts to become a bit more of a difficult task.
Yeah, I agree with you. It was basically around the last 5 minutes of the episode that I finally hinged on something.
Exactly, and I do have things to discuss in relation to the time period, but a lot of it is just timeless, which is irritating.
As Luke said, this one is timeless, even though it very much, it's obviously set in 1970 or 1969 or whatever. It's very dated in that sense, but it feels timeless in terms of the message it's giving. I'm definitely getting the vibe of, and I hope I don't get this vibe from every season 7 serial. I don't think I will for the next 2. But I feel like the character of Quinn, he's a communist sympathizer, isn't he? He wears the furry hat. It's not a Ushanka. It's not a Russian hat, with the flaps that come down the side. But it's sort of a similar shape to the first Doctor's hat, isn't it? But it's furry. I'm thinking, yeah, he's meant to be a communist sympathizer. And let's be honest here, Malcolm Hulke wouldn't be too unaware of communist sympathizers, let's put it that way.
I've never quite portrayed Quinn as a communist sympathizer before, and that might or might not work with the point I'm going to bring up with him in this episode. We shall see.
Yeah, no. Yeah, true. Yeah, I mean, yeah. We can talk more about it when we get there.
Yeah. So we've got different characters and their different sympathies as portrayed in a different culture of television. Interesting. Let's have a look at this episode in more detail. Having hit Liz, the reptile monster hides in the barn again. Miss Dawson visits Dr. Quinn, and he regales her of what the Silurians are doing. They're in it together. Quinn rushes to the farm to try and locate the creature. The Doctor, the Brig and unit recover Liz, and she talks of the reptilian upright creature, which has gone to ground. It's now a race between Quinn and unit to locate the errant reptile. The Doctor and Liz suspect Quinn as he succeeds in locating the creature. Helicopters, dogs, and at least 15 soldiers, and the Doctor and the Brig on Quinn's trail, and Quinn finds the creature first with his device and escapes in open country. Yes, it's open country, but that's kind of funny.
What was so good about this is that you're getting so many vistas now. It's just full of vistas now, Doctor Who, because now that you've just openly said it's on Earth, you don't have to go out to a quarry and say, "Look, Doctor, there's a robot coming out of this rock planet." You can just sort of accept that it's modern day Earth, and then just sort of get on with it, and you can have all your nice sweeping shots, and it doesn't matter what's in the shot, because it's all the same. It's all supposed to be present day Earth.
It's a new sense of scale.
Exactly.
Because you've suddenly got the concept of geography.
Exactly, which you couldn't do in quite the same way before.
No, because in Patrick Troughton's era, you had the geography of several corridors in a base under siege, and Hartnell, you had alien planets and history.
Well, yeah, so just to further the point you're making, you can make it seem realistic on a shoestring budget.
Absolutely. Well, isn't that part of the reason why they went to modern day Earth? Because they're like, spend less money on this.
Well, yeah, 'cause switching to colour was super expensive, so let's just lower the budget costs by setting it on Earth, and then let's take Quatermass as the model, because that was good. Actually, it works.
Yeah, they still failed to keep the budget because Barry Letts was known for breaking the budget, so the BBC had to give him more money. Major Baker and Liz, both victims of being attacked by creatures, have a conversation. Major Baker is still adamant, in trying to get back to the field, but he's not allowed to, much to his annoyance. Having failed to find the creature, the Doctor locates Quinn in his cottage and discovers he's got a very warm house. by barging in like the arse he is. He's guilt-tripping the hell out of Quinn, and I love it. Having failed to get answers, he snoops around in Quinn's office at the research station and finds more paraphernalia of his about prehistoric Earth, because that's important. Dawson catches them, and the Doctor charms her almost enough to reveal the plot, but the Brigadier blunders in, and he fails again to get the right information. Shall I talk about Dawson now? Yeah, the main problem with Dawson's character is that she's imminently connected to Quinn, and then once Quinn's out of the picture, she disappears as well. Her sole trait is weak link in Act 1 plotline, and then she's sidelined by the Silurians, which are much more interesting.
This isn't that surprising that we're being progressive and modern by having a woman being a scientist, but also she's still in the man's shadow. It's not to be unexpected in 1970. And also, sort of the whole, even, like, female's good at things, but also still a woman sort of thing is Liz. So Liz points out, I think it's a bit later on, she realizes that that Quinn, she looks at the map and she's like, hang on a minute, he can't have gone and travelled this way. That's ridiculous because this is so out of his way, and the Doctor didn't notice it. So, ding, good, Liz is good. Hey. But then also Liz acts as nurse in just the bit you've just said, where she goes and checks on Major Baker, and I'm like, why is she checking on Major Baker? She's not a nurse or anything like that, but she's acting like a nurse.
Yeah.
So
Liz then settles into the companion trait of, what's this globe, Doctor?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like they want her to be this, progressive role model, but I think it's written by people who don't know how to write a woman who's as smart as the Doctor. So another bit about this section we've just talked about, I noted down here. Central heating is a big deal, and I quite like that. It feels quite cute that central heating in this cottage. The Doctor comes and he goes, "Oh, you've got central heating," and he's like, "No," he says it. Oh, and that helps him solve. He's like, "Oh, okay, Quinn's got Silurian here because," he's like, "Oh, it's a reptile house because of how hot it is." And I like it something as mundane as central heating, but in 1970, central heating marks you as someone who's a bit fancy, a bit posh. You've got money if you've got central heating in 1970.
And doubly so when you're in the wild moors of Derbyshire.
Which I also like about the whole, he's a communist sympathizer. It's a classic, this is actually probably more relevant now than it was back then, of intellectuals and middle-class people being, having left-wing sympathies. Is even more relevant now than it was back then, because, you probably say that most left-wing people now are middle class. They're not working class, whatever working class means.
It's that also hypocrisy of having those sympathetic tendencies, but then also enjoying the mod cons.
I don't think this is how he set out to write it, but I want to hope that this was a subconscious part of it. I'm enjoying it from this perspective, as well as the perspective of just viewing it from.
And speaking of subtext, how about a little bit more subtext for Quinn? Not political, although actually it is slightly political. Let's get to it anyway. There's another conversation between Dawson and Quinn in his cottage, with one telling the other to just say what needs to be said. But Quinn wants the credit of discovering the Silurians like an overconfident fool. He's locked up the Silurian, whom he calls a similar scientist, and is holding him hostage. This is like the North Korea hijack situation, and it's about to end as bloodily as most North Korea situations, but it also points out that he wants the credit. He's being selfish, which is a cynical view of humanity, because obviously you want to progress humanity, but you also want to take the credit.
So the two main one-dimensional baddies in this are Dr. Quinn and Dr. Lawrence. And I was wondering, why are two doctors, leaving aside the fact that it's Doctor Who, so it's ironic, why are they the ones who are consumed with their own ideas? Why are they the ones who are constantly opposing the Doctor, right?
Mm.
And I was looking into the public perceptions of scientists
Okay.
around this sort of time, and essentially there was a real lack of scientific literacy amongst people generally until the 70s onwards. That's when basically around the world countries were starting to invest in, science educational programs in schools
Mm.
really properly.
Both through public universities and indeed the creation of the Open University.
Absolutely. So it's a bit later on, from what I can gather, that science starts to be equated more with common sense and rationality. And the ambition of these scientists, I wonder how far it reflects sort of a left-wing view of scientists being aligned with military ideals, that Malcolm Hulke, if this is a left-wing view that was circulating at the time, that Malcolm Hulke could have shared,
Well,
and how might be linked into capitalism or the drive for money by scientists.
yeah, no, I think you'd be on something there, Luke. This is definitely scientists are part of the elite. And if you think, as you say, up to this point, university education is a sign of being part of the elite. And these people are all university educated. Yeah, they're more interested in, even though they're being rational or whatever, they're the elites. They want power over the people. So this is Malcolm Hulke's view of scientists, which is of people who are using their knowledge of the laws of nature to acquire fame and notoriety and money out of their knowledge, which I think nowadays people don't have that view of science. I mean, science has opened up to lots more people. It's not just, rich people who can go into it. If you look back in the day, all the famous scientists were all like, children of middle class or wealthy parents, weren't they? For the most part. There was the odd one here and there that wasn't, but it's only a recent phenomenon that you've had people from all sorts of backgrounds able to become physicists or scientists in general. So I think so. We see 60s Doctor Who. The science in it is laughably bad, really bad. But
with the occasional exception of Kit Pedler.
Yeah, but otherwise it's laughably bad. And except we don't mind that because we don't expect much of that. But modern day Doctor Who, we all think, well, it's got to have some grounding in real scientific facts. It can't just be fantasy. That would be bad. So it's interesting because exactly what you said, Luke. Science, we're all more scientifically literate. So we expect more of the science from Doctor Who now than we did 50 years ago.
It's a normalization and it is a equalization of science. The Doctor is certain that the interference to the power station is in the caves. Major Baker, however, is still certain it's sabotage. The Brig, thankfully, is saner for about 5 seconds because once he's taken Major Baker out of the equation, he agrees with him and wants to search the caves militarily anyway. The two scenes, one of Quinn, who's self-indulgent and selfish and wants the credit for himself, then complements with this scene because humans are being selfish again. We have Dr. Lawrence, or not Nider as we call him, being impatient and wanting basically to have his research power station to discover safe atomic nuclear energy and therefore for him to get all the credit. We also have Major Baker, who is one-track, one-minded and thinks there are saboteurs of any political persuasion, right, left, centre, whichever one you want. And the Doctor is basically trying to be a mediator and say, actually, no, let's be rational and find out what the actual cause is. Dr. Lawrence is being impatient and has called in the permanent undersecretary to try and get UNIT out. A put-upon Doctor leaves a put-upon Liz to see Quinn once more and tell him to tell the truth. But Quinn is dead, his hostage is broken out, and is loose in the house. And finally, the Doctor comes face to face with a Silurian.
Close up on Dr. Spooky Eyes!
Yay!
Yeah, they've done as well as they can to disguise the Silurian costume, and now we get to see it in all its glory. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine people in 1970 were that impressed by how it looked.
Well, that's the thing, right? When the show lost black and white, you know, black and white hides all your blemishes really well. If you want to be Barry Letts and have rubber monsters stampeding all over the place that looks like whatever the hell Scribble was running around in Claws of Axos, you're kind of screwed. You're screwed on a BBC budget, my man.
Yeah, no, you're right. And up to this point, creative direction and just trickery has hidden how bad the Silurian looks. Luckily, the story is good enough that you don't really think. Obviously, at the time, it looked, a bit rubbish. And but luckily, because it's such a good story, your mind isn't, nibbling away, going, it looks bad, which you can do in a bad story. So it's got that working for it, but, it still does look a bit naff. And this is probably a sign of how they're still shooting it in black and white in their minds, if you know what I mean. They haven't adapted to colour properly yet. There's a few shots that imply that they're starting to think about how to use colour, but a lot of it is just beige costumes and beige rooms, and people sat in beige costumes and beige rooms talking, which does imply that they haven't learned that colour can be used to do great things, like with the silhouette shot in episode 2 and whatnot. This season we do see colour being used well, but it's fairly sparing, isn't it?
One final point I want to make on the Silurians and how they're let down by their costumes. The Silurians do tend to get shafted, and by extension their cousins, the Sea Devils. So in this episode they've got a great story, but they're let down by the costumes. Same again, arguably, for the Sea Devils. In the revival of the Silurians, 2010, they obviously revitalised the costumes, but are let down in the fact that our now current Lord and Master, Chris Chibnall, basically rehashed the plot to Doctor Who and the Silurians in that two-parter. And the ultimate aberration, of course, is Warriors of the Deep, where nothing works. So the Silurians really are put upon. And then finally, the ultimate point is Stephen Moffat takes one and provides it as one of a comedy trio. Would you like me to wrap up?
Wrap it up like a burrito.
I'll try.
Well, hey.
So what we've got here is a timeless, character-driven, albeit slow, search for a Silurian with selfish scientists and other humans that are ultimately behind the heart of this episode of Doctor Who that was broadcast 50 years ago. Thank you very much for listening. You can find us on Blogspot, which redirects to iTunes. Leave positive comments there, it helps. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube, where you can like, comment and subscribe, and Google Plus, if that's still a thing. We shall be back next week with the Silurians episode 4, where we might continue to investigate things that begin with S. Until then, I've been Ben.
I've been Luke.
And I've been Nix.